Good afternoon, hi, and welcome back here at ZEIT für Demokratie. In this session, we will talk about how democracy is under threat in a digitalized world, how the public opinion is being manipulated by defamation, propaganda, and lies, and most importantly, of course, how we can prevent that from happening. My name is Johanna Roth. I am an editor at ZEIT Online here in Berlin, and I am delighted to welcome four very interesting guests to this panel. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Hello and welcome Lutz Göllner, Head of Unit for Strategic Communication and Information Analysis at the European External Action Service, EEAS. His work focuses on disinformation, information manipulation, and hybrid threats. His responsibilities include the strategic communication task forces in the eastern neighborhood of the EU, the Western Balkans, and the Southern Mediterranean and Middle East region. Welcome. Thanks for being here. I'd like to welcome Professor Philip Howard, who teaches sociology, information and international affairs, or in short, internet studies, I read, at the University of Oxford. He also directs the program on democracy and technology there. He investigates the impact of digital media on political life around the world, and he is a frequent commentator on global media and political affairs. He also has won multiple Best Book Awards for his writing. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome Ben Nimmo, who is Facebook's Global Threat Intelligence Lead for Influence Operations. Maybe we will talk about that later, what exactly you do there. He co-founded the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab and later served as Graphica's first head of investigations. He has helped to expose foreign election interference in the US, UK and France, documented troll operations in Asia, Africa, Europe and the Americas, and he also has been declared dead by an army of Twitter bots. Maybe you will share this experience later with us. And finally, welcome Mareike Uhlberg, Dr. Mareike Uhlberg, who is a senior fellow in the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund and co-leads the Stockholm China Forum. Before joining the GMF, Mareike worked as an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, where she focused on China's media and digital policies, politics, as well as the China's Communist Party's influence campaigns in Europe. We will certainly talk about that later. She has spent several years living and working in Greater China, and she also is a frequent commentator in the media. Welcome you all. Thanks for being here. I'm very excited to speak with you. Welcome to our audience, you behind the screens. Thanks for listening and not only listening. Please make good use of the opportunity to ask questions during our discussions. You will have the possibility all the time. Please just use the Slido tool to type in and submit your questions, and I will try to include all of them here on stage. So, I would like to start with asking all of you the same question. What is, from your point of view, your expertise, your working field, the biggest threat to democracy these days? Maybe you would like to start, Mareike.
Sure, I can get started, and obviously this is a very big question, and I do want to tackle it from the perspective of the digital sphere and disinformation in the digital sphere. Obviously, there are plenty of other challenges for democracy, but one of the bigger challenges that I see in particular when it comes to disinformation is the asymmetry in speed. I mean, the classic example that you give, of course, is that it takes very little time to spread false information, and it takes a lot of time to debunk it, to spread the message, what is actually correct. And oftentimes that doesn't even reach the people who initially received the false information. The same is true for bot networks. There was a report on the BBC about a network, I think a Chinese bot network of 350 people. I don't know, Phil, if you were actually involved in that. And people were making fun of it and said, look, 350 people, that's nothing. And my point that I made was, look, this is a problem precisely because, one, we know it's more than 350 people. It takes a second to create a network of that time, and it takes painstaking work to uncover only 350 of a network that is much, much larger. So this asymmetry in how to put stuff out there and how to counter it is a very fundamental problem.
Ben, please, your take.
Sure, I'm actually going to pull the lens out, and my background is originally in literature and medieval studies, so I take a long view of these things. My sense is actually that the greatest threat to democracy at the moment is unaddressed crises, because they create the groundswell, they create the fertile ground, if you like, for everything that we see and worry about today. If you have a crisis that goes unaddressed, it can be a society-wide crash. You know, think of the financial crash earlier this century. If you think about climate crises, if you think about COVID, you have a sudden shock to the system, which leaves millions of people feeling lost. If that isn't addressed, then they feel abandoned, they feel betrayed, and they feel angry. And if somebody then comes along and says, I hear your anger, you're right to be angry, there's a really simple solution, and it's to blame this person over here. That's the fertile ground where the kind of interference operations that we see can then take hold. And that means that whenever we're talking about influence operations online, whenever we're talking about interference operations online, one of the things we always have to remember is that these are aimed at influencing people. It's ultimately about the people. And if the solution doesn't take the people into account as well, then the fertile ground is still there. And if you think about the times we're living in right now, how many crises can you count all in one go? So one of the challenges for democracies is to think about what's the ground where the interference can take hold, and how do you reduce that risk? And it's a very, very complex problem set. There's no one solution to it. But if we start forgetting that, then that's where you get this sense of abandonment, and that's where so many interference operations can start to take hold.
Mm-hmm. Philip, you're nodding.
Well, I agree with everything Ben and Marika have said so far. I think misinformation is, to me, misinformation is the biggest threat to democracy, because it's the thing that prevents movement on any other policy issue, or it's the thing that can interfere with any other good decision-making process. And as Marika says, we often only just know the tip of the iceberg. We catch a few hundred accounts and we think they lead to networks of thousands more, or these campaigns deflect issues to get us to focus on things that are non-issues, that are not serious, and we ignore the ones that the economic or social or cultural issues that are critical. So I think it is, to form a blockage in political process, and it's difficult to know what we're missing and how to move forward on some of the political conversations we know we need to have.
Lutz, please.
I would, of course, agree, but maybe add two additional points. The one is kind of this erosion of trust in conversations, of how we exchange kind of as human beings as well. If this is eroding, I think we have a huge problem in general. And of course, this is amplified by the issue that we talk about. And the second thing that's much more to this disinformation issue is, I think you will ask the question in a moment, but how do we see it? What does it do exactly? And I always kind of point, it's not the big bang that we will see that disinformation will change an election overnight. It's the steady, slow erosion kind of this development. It's a long-term perspective. It's the background noise that slowly seeps in. I think this is something we need to watch. And that's why it's not so important whether it's 350 accounts or 350,000 accounts. It is happening and it is working, and that is the problem.
What I found remarkable here is that all of you barely mentioned digitalization and the internet, but it sounded like it was not inherent. It was in a bigger context. And of course, tactics of propaganda and manipulation have been there way before the internet. Marika, I think you wrote your dissertation about that. So how have these tactics of propaganda and manipulation developed and maybe Lutz, you would like to continue. You said it's what we're missing here. Please, could you elaborate on that?
Mareike, you kick off, or?
Oh.
I mean, I can also comment. That's fine. And I think I mean, in many ways, a lot of stuff that we see, it simply uses new technologies to do things that were done in the past in a different way and makes it perhaps more efficient. And again, I'm going to go back to the bot networks, which is something I just looked into. And it used to be the case that, the Chinese government would literally hire hundreds of thousands of people who would, receive instructions in the morning and would then begin to comment on certain articles, upvote certain articles, downvote certain articles. Now,
I think we are having a technical issue.
Helping these people do their jobs either by, I don't know if I'm back yet.
You're back, yes, we can hear you. Now we can hear you. Could you maybe repeat the last
two
sentences?
Right now, So right now, technology is merely helping these people doing their job more efficiently by working through an app to send out commands, by automating some of the activity of, having a comment library that you can draw on where you can, send multiple comments at the same time and simply automate some of this. So it's making it only more effective, but it's drawing on similar techniques.
Mm-hmm.
About the digitalization is not the challenge to democracy. The challenge to democracy is how it's misused, of course, and how we need to learn how to deal with this and build kind of rules of the game. And I think we'll speak about this in a moment. I think you had a couple of panels already beforehand. How much do we understand actually what is happening with this tool? But I would like to reinforce the point of Mareike. It's kind of technology is the vehicle. It's the instrument that is being used. In very many cases, we see patterns that are not new. It's just the way they have been translated, they have been accelerated, and how kind of new instruments have been used to be more targeted, faster, more precise. This is, I think, the new form. Propaganda, disinformation, misinformation has been around all the time, has been an issue all over the place. It's nothing new. It's just the way, the speed and the precision that it can be used, and this asymmetry that Mareike also mentioned. I think this is a very important point.
So,
if I can,
yeah, of course, please go ahead.
If we're talking about the evolution of influence operations in the shorter term and in the digital space, I think it's actually really important to balance the picture and to understand that we've seen a lot of evolution since, let's say, 2016, but quite a lot of that evolution has been forced by the responses that we've seen. And there were responses on multiple levels. We've seen government responses, we've seen platform responses, we've seen the whole development of civil society, right? 7 years ago, DFR Lab did not exist. We founded it in 2016. So some of the trends we've seen speak to the fact that this is not all about the influence operations can do everything they want. It speaks to the fact that thanks to all the different people looking at this, from journalists through to platform researchers through to academics, this stuff is getting caught and it's getting taken down, and they're finding it harder. If you compare the Russian Internet Research Agency, God bless it, it's a really useful case study because they keep on coming back. They keep on trying again. But if you compare the IRA in 2016 with the IRA that was taken down last year, the IRA 2016 was big, it was noisy, it was spammy, it was running hundreds of accounts. Its operational security wasn't actually particularly sophisticated. There were many slip-ups they made. And they were noisy, and they were very effective at getting people to engage across all the different platforms they were on. If you compare that with the operations they were running last year, they were creating 4 or 5 very complex backstop personas with accounts on all the different social platforms you can think of, AI-generated profile pictures, quite deep personas. They created a fake media entity, and then they hired real people to write for them. And then they would slant the editorial tone to make a particular political point. It's the same entity doing that. It's the Russian IRA, but it looks like they realized if they run a big noisy campaign, they're going to get caught, they're going to get taken down. So they've invested more and more in trying to hide and in trying to cover their traces. And so we've seen a lot of developments in the influence operations space, but they're not all negative developments. We've seen a lot of pushback. We've seen a lot of exposures. On the Facebook side, we've seen, I think, over 150 different operations taken down in the last couple of years. And so the situation we're in now is, it's not an arms race so much as a brains race. You still have threat actors out there, but it's really important to remember how many people you have on our side, like including everybody on this call, whose specialization and job and vocation is finding this stuff and exposing it. And so one of the questions to be asking is, how do we strengthen the sort of whole of society response? How do we get better on the defensive side at dealing with influence operations? And how do we keep our hope? It's very easy to say the world's going to end, democracy is going to end. That's been predicted many times over the years. How do we keep our sense of balance and hope and perspective? And that's all the while we're talking about the problems we see. We also, for me, we need to be thinking about what are the solutions and what are we already doing that's working?
Can I offer a couple of thoughts on what's new as well? I think another thing that's changed since 2016 is that it's no longer just about foreign-backed media operations. A lot of the tools in the toolkit are used domestically by domestic actors. It's our own white supremacists, chauvinists, and in many countries it's very difficult for elected leaders to acknowledge the fact that it's their own home forces that are applying many of the tools that the IRA or Chinese-backed operations have used. I think the other thing that's changed is that many of these techniques, these campaigns, are run by professional, regular, mainstream comms operations in Toronto and London and DC. It's no longer just military units that have been retasked to doing social media. It's part of the toolkit now in a number of different of the large global comms houses, and I think that's made it domestically prevalent in a number of democracies around the world.
We have a first question from the audience. I think which fits right in here, because you mentioned that it's also a domestic issue. We might talk about that later too, but I want to include this question here. Democratic societies determine in their basic laws how they want to live together. Can't we also define that for a virtual space? Interesting question. Who would like to start? Philip is nodding.
I think the answer is yes. I certainly hope the answer is yes. And I think one of the positive things to think about here is that many of the rules that we would want to enforce for healthy political communication in most democracies are already on the books. We already have them down. The fines may need to ratchet up a notch, and many of the electoral administrative agencies that we have aren't as well funded as they needed to be. The cybersecurity of public agencies isn't always as strong as it needs to be. And one of the tricks for us now is that elected politicians will also rarely vote for more fines on politicians. So it's very difficult to get the law. Many of the big domestic campaigns, propaganda campaigns, are paid for by regular political parties or mainstream politicians. And unless we have that mechanism for taking a fine or removing somebody's from public office, until we have that in place for this digital era, upgrading and modernizing those laws, I think democracy will be on weak footing.
Ben, I imagine working for Facebook, you might have a slightly different view on laws concerning the internet. Would you mind sharing your opinion?
Absolutely, and some degree and some form of regulation is, I think, both. It's going to happen, and to some extent, it needs to happen. One of the things to bear in mind is that what the unique nature of the internet is that it's cross-border. So you log into the same social media platform, regardless of what country you're in, with notable exception of China. And so one of the things to be thinking about really carefully is how do you avoid too much of a patchwork of legislation? If every country has different rules, then where do you stand? How do you do this? But there are, beyond the idea of regulation, there's also the sense or the question, have we effectively created societies online without creating social norms? And if so, what are the social norms that need to apply? Beyond any question of regulation or legislation, what are the standards of behavior that are expected? And to Phil's point, where do we have the conversation about what is legitimate political campaigning compared with what is inauthentic behavior? If it's okay to pay people to go and knock on people's doors and say, hey, I'm supporting this party, is it okay to pay people to post on social media saying, hey, I support this party, if they're doing it in their own name? Is that different from paying people to run 3 different accounts, to do it on 3 different platforms in 3 different names? There's a whole debate to be had around the creation of social norms and the understanding of social norms on social media. There's a reason we talk about social media, right? But if we have social media without social norms, part of the debate needs to be, how do we get to an understanding of what is acceptable behavior? And that's a discussion which it's starting in some places, but I think we need to have a lot more of.
Mm-hmm. So a discussion to have in a society, not on the level of lawmaking.
I think that there are two. You're going to have a discussion on lawmaking anyway, but if you only have law and you don't have the buy-in of the society, you're always going to be in a very fragile situation. So I think there are the 2 discussions that need to be going on. Mm-hmm. And for me, the understanding of the social norm and what's actually acceptable is probably more important. It'll take longer to define, but once it's defined, it will then probably take longer to change. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that would be the more long-term, the more impactful one to be discussing.
Lutz, you are working at the. Oh, you already like to ask something. I just wanted to say.
I'd like to ask the question because.
Yeah, I was just imagining what you're thinking, because you already work at the intersection of many states not having laws but rules, at least, trying to find to solve this dilemma, to have different societies with different standards, norms, rules, and yet to find a rule and regulation for these matters.
Absolutely. Well, I strongly agree with one point, and I also disagree with a couple of points from Ben. But the first one is, it is kind of trans-border. It doesn't make any sense to have a law in Germany and another one in Austria and another one in Italy. And that's why, at least here from a European perspective, we have suggested, okay, we'll come up with this, but what we need eventually is a broad coalition. Also, we need common approaches worldwide. Otherwise, this will not work. And I think you had already a round of discussions earlier this morning on issues like Digital Services Act, etc. I don't want to bore the audience, with the technical details, but this is the attempt to set rules of the game, Where I also agree with Ben is you cannot just regulate the problem away. This is too big, and this is too deep in the social structure as well. And that's why you can have a perfect kind of whatever quite hands-on regulation. But if this is not kind of well connected with political reality and social reality, it will not work. And here we have tried something at European level, which maybe some of the audience might know, and where we called, okay, let's first of all look at it from a democracy perspective. And democracy has many aspects in terms of how do we promote it, how do we protect it, etc. But kind of political rules of the game are part of this. The media kind of rules of the game are part of that. And of course, this whole question about how do we get the digital/social media in there. And they're all interconnected. And that makes it so difficult to come up with easy answers, to these problems. But I strongly believe that we need some form of regulation, and it most likely will evolve over time. It needs to be adapted. Maybe last thought, that is, of course, we are faced from a policy-making perspective with a tremendous problem. This is such a fast-moving area. The moment we have actually put something on paper and adopted it, it might already be outdated. 2-3 years ago in Germany, there was the debate about whether we should maybe kind of have a sort of prohibition of bots, of automated accounts. As Ben knows much better, and Phil and Mareike than I from their practical work, is the bots are still around, but they don't play the key role at the moment. It is new forms. It is new forms how this is disguised. And if we had actually enacted a law, we would now have a law that wouldn't serve for anything because the issue has already progressed. So we need to balance these things. I'm quite convinced of that.
Mareike, speaking of broad coalitions, China may not be the first to think of there, and also there you maybe have the other side of regulation, censoring and restricting social media. You have been doing a lot of work and research on that. Maybe you would like to add what you're thinking of here.
Sure. I think my main point that I would want to make here, and this somehow it does tie back a little bit to what China is doing, even though I don't want to equate anything that is happening here and what's happening in China. But generally speaking, in the last couple of years, we've seen some experimentation with behavior-based rules. And we've also started seeing some experimenting with content-based rules. And of course, there are individual countries that will, enforce their own laws on certain contents that you can and cannot have. And even though the behavior-based approach is also difficult in that, behaviors change and adapt fast, I feel like we will get a lot further if we have the rule set centered on behavior rather than on content and try to determine, is this correct or not? Is this against some country's law? Because then you get this fragmented system where different countries take vastly different approaches. Then you get the situation where some information that is now actually considered as not crazy was considered crazy a couple of months ago might end up getting censored or might end up getting soft blocked. And that is simply not a good long-term solution. So I'm a strong advocate for behavior-based rules, even though that is, of course, difficult and you always have to catch up. But in the end, that's a much better approach than experimenting with content-based approach.
How would that look like, behavior-based regulation?
I mean, that's simply, whether that is, a bot ban or not, but you can have certain behaviors, like you can discover bot networks when they're created. You can sometimes spot coordination. You can also sometimes spot targeted harassment. There are certain ways in which you can find certain behaviors. And that's what I mean, that you would, ban certain behaviors on platforms rather than certain content. There's a lot of room for debate here, but that's basically what I mean. Make it behavior based. How are you acting on these platforms?
I think Phil has something to add.
Yeah, may I expand the notion of behavior that we're talking about here? For the most part, we were talking about the public, and I think it's important to talk about the behavior of the social media firms as well. So it's totally fine to say the public should read more newspapers, or the public should get more education, or be smarter, tech-savvy citizens. We should certainly work on and invest in those long-term things. The proximate cause of the problem is that social media firms serve up misinformation in the 3 to 5 days before citizens vote. That's the proximate cause we should also spend time thinking about. So, firms have a role in public life. I think it would be healthy if they shared data with researchers. I think it would be healthy if they, we don't want them acting on censors on their own, but we do want them being proactive, especially on things like misinformation and hate speech, targeted campaigns against LGBTQs or race-based hate speech. We do want to see proactivity there. So this should be about long-term investment in nudging and encouraging good social public behavior. But we also need the social media firms themselves to behave as good corporate citizens.
Ben, is Facebook a good corporate citizen?
Facebook is always trying to be a better corporate citizen, I think would be fair. To Phil's point, and also to Maveka's point, there is actually an important distinction between behavior-based enforcement and content-based enforcement. And the field I work in, so I'm a specialist in influence operations. Most of what we're looking at there is inauthentic behavior. So it's the central use of fake accounts to deceive people, to run long-running campaigns. That's my background. And what we're looking at there is a particular set of behaviors which say this is an operation, it's being essentially controlled, it's a set of behaviors on platform, and there are responses that you can do to that. When you start talking about misinfo, when you start talking about hate speech, you're firmly in the realm of content-based enforcement. And that's a very, very complex field to be in, because what do you do if somebody is saying that in their own name, in their own voice, and they're saying it authentically? Now, there is some speech which is clearly outlawed, advocacy for terrorist groups, outlawed, right? Hate speech, how well is hate speech defined? How do you define hate speech? Once you're down to the level of content-based enforcement, you're down to that very fine-grained linguistic analysis of what does this mean? Is this hate speech, or is it satire? Or is it just somebody using a clumsy turn of phrase? Is one person interpreting it as hate speech and another one not? And so on content-based enforcement, it's a complex space. I will be frank, it's not my area of specialization. My specialization is on the behavior side. But when you're talking content-based enforcement, you're often talking about what real people are saying in their own voice. And you have to be, there's always going to be an argument which says the platforms should be taking down more. There's always going to be an argument which says the platforms should be taking down less. And finding the balance is something that every platform is grappling with. It's something that every platform that comes new onto the market will grapple with. To the point we had earlier, if we'd been talking about social media 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about the same platforms as we are now. You know, there are new entrants and the ones that come down. And so part of what we all need to be discussing is, what are the rules of speech, of authentic speech on social media, compared with the rules of authentic speech everywhere else? If you can't say it on social media, should you be allowed to say it in the pub? How are you meant to police that? And so part of the debate is around this question of, when something is somebody's authentic speech, first off, how are you defining what's acceptable? And then secondly, what enforcement are you expecting? Should you just take down the whole account? Should you take down a single post? Should you mask the single post? We've seen with fact checking, for example, the post stays up, but there's an interstitial which says this has been rated by third-party fact checkers, and here is the link to the verified information. Right? It's probably the most complex problem set on social media writ large. Real people saying things in their own voices that they happen to believe, or that they appear to believe, or that they may believe, because there you're straight into the question of free speech. Mm-hmm. And if you say anybody who says X should be taken down, then that's such a blunt instrument. The fallout, the collateral damage that you'll be causing will probably be quite substantial. And so for all the platforms and for all of us in this space, this is an ongoing debate. We haven't solved the problem. We haven't got there yet. We're trying to get better all the time. But this is right at the core of one of the problem sets. How do you deal with real people saying things in their own voice?
Maybe let's get back to that in a minute when we speak about gaining back trust or strengthening trust, as Lutz mentioned earlier. I would like to talk about elections, because we have 2 important elections coming up this year in Germany in a few weeks, next year in France. We also have the midterm elections, but in the US. But maybe let's stay here in Europe with these 2 key elections. Lutz, what are your main concerns regarding these elections, and what have we learned from the past?
Is always good to assess the risk, and then we need to check what is actually happening, or if we are actually seeing everything that we should look at. And what we have learned from 2016 US elections, what we have learned from the French presidential elections, what we have learned from many other elections is that there is a serious risk of some form of interference, of some form of manipulation, obviously from inside and from outside, but the outside is the more problematic side now from a foreign policy, from a security perspective. So I would say we need to be very, very vigilant. We need to have kind of structures in place that allow us to address kind of these threats. Now, if I can preempt already your question, what have you seen in terms of the German elections that are coming up? Actually, I can only speak for my team, our work that we have published. We have not seen a major kind of manipulation campaign that I could refer to, or where I have any evidence. That doesn't mean that something might happen somewhere, you know. It's just with the instruments and with the things that we have developed, also looking in the past, that we don't see this at the moment. But I think the key point is not so much kind of to cry wolf all the time and to put the let's say to find somebody who's interfering, because even the message that something might happen is actually already kind of a problematic element. And Ben can speak much more authoritatively to this. It's called perception laundering, you know, so that actually nothing is happening, and just with a few kind of little events, you know, it looks as if something massive is ongoing. And also there we need to find the good balance. But I think in conclusion, what is really important is that state, so kind of let's say the authorities need to be prepared for this on multiple fronts, in terms of technical manipulation, in terms of these tactics that we have seen, and it needs to be a societal debate, as we discussed at the beginning. So I would really put it in the category, yes, a real risk, but not always a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, that is the point, I think.
I imagine that the more complex the situation gets, the harder it makes it to work with. Mareike, is there an increasing interest that you notice in, for example, elections in European countries in China?
So I actually got asked quite a bit whether I expect any major interference from the Chinese side in the German elections. My impression is quite similar to Lutz's. I don't see it for now. I don't think there is a lot. The point I want to make here is actually similar to the point that Lutz just made, and that is that we have the expectation, oh, something has to happen now, and if it happens now, it's not going to happen, or it's all harmless, or nothing is happening. We know that the Chinese government has the ability to interfere in elections from cases that it cares deeply about, like Taiwan or Hong Kong, when there were better elections in Hong Kong. I don't think they currently have the interest to do this for the German election. There's also significant risk attached to it. So I don't think it is going to happen, but the capacity is technically there. So I think I'd be very surprised to see something this year. But I still think it's worthwhile to study some of the examples that we do have of previous election interference and understand that if this were to, like, this is how it happened in the past, and the capacity is there, and the capacity might evolve. So again, nothing major for now. I'd be really surprised, but that doesn't mean that nothing is happening.
So what would be important to counter such threats, if you're not sure if they occur, of course, but how are we prepared, for example, in Europe for these kind of threats? Mareike, could you elaborate?
I have to say, on the Chinese side, actually not that well. I think a lot has happened in terms of how we track misinformation and interference from Russia and from several other actors. I feel like a lot of what is happening in what you can call the sinosphere, which can also have an impact on either in Chinese or in Chinese circles, still gets disregarded because the idea is, oh, that's just in Chinese, or that just doesn't concern us. So it's not tracked as thoroughly, and there are a lot of campaigns ongoing where I would say that's clearly inauthentic behavior, but it hasn't been caught, or people aren't paying attention to, simply because we have the idea that it only matters if it interferes directly with our electoral politics, which of course, yes, that should be a focus. But at the same time, you need to understand what's happening in other arenas, because understanding that a little better can then help you deal with it more effectively once it does affect you at some point, and once somebody decides to refocus that energy and focus some of it on you. So I feel like, especially in these networks and misinformation, disinformation originating from China, we actually need to pay a lot more attention to what is happening in spheres that don't directly affect us, but that are still relevant, such as in Chinese language spaces, which there are plenty of them on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something where I feel like we could actually learn a lot if we paid more attention to it.
Philip, maybe to add something here, I think a few years back you wrote an article about the Internet of Things and how it might threaten democracy and how politics should be feared of this. So if we move away a little from concrete threats here from certain countries, what should we pay attention to there?
Well, I think one of the lessons from the last few years is that if a political actor, domestic or foreign, can get access to data about us, about our political preferences, and can figure out how to manipulate things and manipulate messages, produce the faces that we'll respond to artificially, or the rhetoric that will activate us, the political actor will play. Lobbyists will try that stuff. And one of the reasons Mareka's research on China is so important is because China has just really arrived in the last 2 years, putting its significant analytical weight behind information operations that I don't think are targeted at the average citizen. They're targeted at elected leaders and professional journalists and our political representatives in Brussels. We just did a report on a series of Chinese ambassadors to foreign governments who all had very active, highly automated campaigns behind them. So this is about public diplomacy. Right, there the goal is to influence other national leaders, not the average voter. For me, one of the nightmare scenarios for the years ahead would be if the big data that we generate from our smart devices gets merged with content from the social media platforms and gets put into service for political ideology. So, a data agreements between a major platform like Facebook and a chip developer like Samsung, right, that records our behavior, our movement in physical space, our body temperatures, our long-term health data. All that stuff can be used to generate political inferences, and hopefully we'll have our rules in place before that kind of data really starts to flow and get merged. But for the most part, I don't think we're ready.
On the point of elections, one of the things that we've already seen, as Lutz referenced, is this idea of perception hacking, where an operation pretends to have achieved much more than it really has, but it points to it and says, look, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and you don't know how much else we have out there. And a related trend that we've seen in the last year and a half or so is operations that they won't try and reach a mass audience directly. They'll try and reach influencers or journalists or politicians and land a piece of content in front of them and then get that person to spread it. We had a case a couple of months ago where there was a Russian marketing firm which was emailing influencers and offering to pay them to spread COVID-19 misinformation. And with both of those, it's the kind of tactic that will work best in the immediate build-up to an election. And ironically, it feeds off the fear and the perception of influence operations. So particularly with a perception hack, there was an attempt in November 2018 at the US midterms when the Russian Internet Research Agency started emailing journalists and saying, hi, we're the IRA, and here's a short list of accounts that we just had taken down, and we've got millions more, and we've already thrown your election. Now, thankfully, by that point in the US, people were aware enough to think, no, this is not actually a thing. But something to be really aware of as we go into election time is if there are claims of hugely successful influence operations, the question to ask is, what's the evidence? You're saying this is the biggest thing since the invention of the internet. Prove it. What have you got? Have you got accounts with billions of followers? Have you got proof that this story created by the operation ended up in every mainstream media outlet in the country? There are ways that you can measure how far an operation goes. And if the proof that's put forward is 5 posts on one platform, then the response needs to be, you have no evidence. This does not prove anything other than 5 accounts on one platform. And so particularly as the election comes up, the more people can ask themselves the question, what did this actually achieve? Where is the evidence to back up the claim? Then it'll be like putting the handbrake on the operation. It can try and push forward, but it's going to face much, much more resistance. And particularly around election time, when there's a set deadline, maybe a story will only come out 48 hours before voting day. It's critical to have that kind of, sorry for the pun, to have that kind of critical thinking.
Is that something you try to achieve, Lutz, in your work, to get evidence of possible interference? Because I think you just mentioned diplomacy, Philip, that creates a new dilemma, right? Of if you have evidence, then but you still have relations with states like China or Russia, then you have to react in some way.
Well, we play a bit a special role here at European level. I think my team was the first kind of government team that was doing this work very publicly as well. And it's not, and still I wouldn't claim for the work that we are doing that we see everything and everywhere. I see it much more of, look, there is something ongoing that all of us as a community, I mean, obviously we speak here to our own EU member states, that we need to collectively invest in, first of all, understanding what's going on, and secondly, developing kind of our ability to, let me use a very strong word, to protect us against it, you know? And this protection goes in many areas, goes into education policy, goes into regulation that we discussed already, but also goes into foreign and security policy. But maybe I just wanted to make one point again also, because the biggest problem in discussing the misinformation, disinformation issue is always, what are we talking about actually? And I think Mareike made this point already about this behavior point. I would really like to use one term, and that is the intentional manipulation. So there is somebody out there, needless of what he or she says, but there is a clear intention to manipulate, to change something, to mislead other people. That is actually the element in German. You would say the Tatbestand of Täuschung, which is the point. And we need to be able to translate this into the digital sphere. And for me, my own colleagues always get a bit nervous when I use this analogy. But for me, it's a bit like consumer protection. You know, there are people out there who want to consume bad things. You know, who want to kind of see crappy products and crappy information. We are democracy. We let them, of course. There shouldn't be a law that forbids that. But those who are looking for quality information, who look for kind of, let's say, information that is objective or something, they should be able to find it. That we should be able to protect them, that they are not misled. That is a bit the idea, and our role is to translate this also in the international sphere with international partners in particular, to mold this kind of this joint approach, I think.
Just a quick note to the audience: you still have the opportunity to ask questions via Slido, so please don't hesitate to submit your questions. We have about 10 minutes left. I think you mentioned an important point here that I wanted to make too. how are we, what are we supposed to do as citizens, as users of social media, as consumers of the news media, for example? What do you wish, maybe each of you, what do you wish everyone knew? Philip, would you like to start?
Thank you. I think there's a number of good information hygiene habits, right? The most basic of which is read something before you forward it, right? And encourage your friends and family to read something before they share. It's always healthy to go back over your follower list or the account you're following and remove things that you don't, remove accounts, users you don't know, you don't trust. So much of this has been smartly pointed out, varies by whether we're talking about TikTok or a YouTube channel. It's what we're actually talking about varies from platform to platform. But spending a little time grooming, being diligent with your own social media networks, if you can, trying to put in some diversity into your media networks. So one slightly conservative newspaper, one mainstream newspaper, one slightly liberal newspaper. We know what these habits look like, and I think spending a little bit of time maintaining our own information hygiene is going to be healthy for democracy at large.
Marijke, what do you think?
I mean, honestly, I'm going in a similar direction. I generally, if everybody had more self-reflection in how they approach information, in how they approach their own point of view, and how they accept that when they don't have to have a stance on everything, it's perfectly fine not to have a strong stance on something. You don't have to have an opinion on everything. To seek out more information, to verify information before you forward it. And some people do this and they're absolutely exemplary, but they're not the majority. But if we could have a little more of that across most social media users, then actually, I guess we would be a lot closer to the original idea of the internet as this platform where you will in the end always find the true information, because once you crowdsource information, you're more likely to come up with true information. So I think if everybody had more of this reflective approach, we would get a lot closer to this ideal that we used to have about the internet as this actually being a good instrument to crowdsource intelligence.
Ben, Lutz, you both are experts for influence operations. Maybe Lutz, you would like to continue what you wish everyone was paying attention to.
That governments need to do, but there are also things that individuals can do. And unsurprisingly, it's very close to what Phil and Marijke have said. But I would say bring a very healthy portion of not suspicion, but just kind of where does this stuff come from? As always, if you take a newspaper, you go to a newspaper shop and there are about 900 newspapers, maybe not so many, but 90 newspapers, that are on display. You make a choice and a little bit kind of what is the framing, and very seldom you would buy a totally unknown newspaper, read it, and believe everything that is in there. And I think if you get this same habit also for online, that is very important. And one thing, maybe Ben will not agree, but I think I would also be extremely suspicious if on a social network, I am personally targeted in a very personal manner from an unknown person. Because that would be for me an indication of either a commercial or a political kind of micro-targeting campaign where I would be extremely careful about where this comes from. But these are partly also my personal thoughts on this one.
Ben, do you agree or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, so something we've seen is influence operations trying to co-opt real people. So particularly if you're an influencer on social media and somebody emails you to say, hey, we've got a great campaign about how evil this particular company is, and here are 3 links for you as evidence, so you don't need to do any research yourself. All the alarm bells should be going off, because that's exactly what we saw a couple of months back with one influence campaign. There's an attempt to co-opt real people. But for me, I mean, I agree with everything the guys have said so far. The one thing I would add is, if you see a post that makes you angry or scared, take a step back and ask, who's trying to manipulate me? Because so often in so many of the influence campaigns I see, there's emotional targeting that comes first. You try and make people angry, you try and trigger outrage, you try and make them scared. Because once people are in that fight or flight mentality, they're so much easier to manipulate, and it's so much harder to think critically. And so we see time and again deliberate targeting of emotional content by influence operations, trying to make people angry, trying to make people scared. And if we can all train ourselves that the first reaction should just be to step back and say, okay, this is a post which is designed to trigger anger or fear. Who's trying to manipulate me? Then we're engaging with the content in a completely different way. So I mean, beyond everything that Mareike and Phil and Lutz said, that would be the one for me. Beware that emotional targeting.
Now that has become increasingly important probably in these last 18 months because the COVID-19 pandemic has been a very trying and hard time for the public trust, and many lies and misinformation has been flying around. Maybe we can finish with the question of trust that you mentioned, Lutz, in the first minutes of our debate. If we put the whole thing in a bigger context, how to save and keep safe democracy by trying to hold and gain back trust that maybe has been lost. Maybe we can talk about this for these last minutes. What is needed to keep trust, to gain it back, and where do we, meaning we, the media, need to do better here from your point of view? Interesting question. Mareike, please go ahead.
Sure. Another of those big questions to which there are absolutely no easy answer. And that's obviously, if I had a 3-step manual here, how to do this, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I think honestly, a lot of the reading habits that we just mentioned for social media would also, are generally good guidelines for how to conduct conversations in general across different divides, how to push back against some of the polarization that we...
Now we seem to have lost you, Mareike. Now you're back. No.
That I don't principally, I think there are plenty, I think there are many media who are doing this right. I think if I had to give one specific recommendation to media, and I know this is difficult to do, but I do think we face a bit of an issue where media is increasingly, I think if we had more localization of some media, where a lot of local media are actually getting dissolved or no longer exist, and there's this increasing perceptions, well, this is us, and those are, your top 5 elite media in Berlin, that, live in a different world. And if we could reverse some of that trend, that would probably also be helpful to have some local media to make sure that there is, and this is obviously an incredibly difficult thing, but to have quality journalism at the local level as well for several issues, that would also help.
Lutz.
Well, it's a difficult question, obviously, as Mareike said. It's partly a job that you need to do also as journalists, but it's also partly a job of the governments, to let you do your job, and to protect you. And if I can use, for example, the second element, the moment that the media system is under threat in terms of intimidations, etc., that is usually an indicator for disinformation also, and very often from domestic governments, by the way, if I can be very blunt. At the same time, in functioning democracies, especially in the European Union, I would also turn it a little bit around and say that's a job that both governments and the society and the media sector, the journalists, need to do together, really to see where is the threat going, what do I need to be careful of. And maybe one element we didn't speak about, and I know that Mareike is a great specialist for that, is With economic pressure, for example, media becomes vulnerable to influence, and in the worst case, even to manipulation. And this is an issue, I think, that should concern all society, which we need to discuss. But okay, these were only a few snippets, of a much bigger problem, but a few of these ideas in any case.
Thanks. Phil, please, your thoughts.
Thank you. I think the trust in the news media is wrapped up with trust in social media, because so much of news media we now consume on social media, and social media gets the revenue, gets the profits from the professional journalism. Hello?
We have seemed to.
Hi. I think the trust in news media and social media is wrapped up together, and so there's a range of policy solutions different countries are considering. One of them involves having the social media firms direct flow of revenue back into professional journalism. I think that would be one of the best ways to produce, to encourage and bolster the industry. Whether it's antitrust or tax or funds, I mean, there's a variety of financial instruments. On the whole, I think those are better than content regulation instruments, and I think would raise trust in the news sphere.
Ben, you have the last word.
Thank you. In terms of restoring trust, it's such a huge question, and for me, so much of what we're talking about goes back to crises which are unaddressed, because then you have sort of a festering wound which is just not being addressed. So part of it has to be work out what people are really unhappy about, work out why they feel that their lives are in crisis, and then maybe we should talk about doing something about that. But in terms of what the media could do in the information operations sphere, which is my job, just be discerning. Not all influence operations are the same. Most of the ones that I've seen had very little impact. Only a few got onto a national or a global stage. And it's really important to take the stop and think, well, what am I looking at here? Is it just one account with 0 followers, or is it actually something big? And being discerning and being calm is something that falls on all of us. If we let ourselves be driven by anger and fear, society is going to struggle. If we can get that first step of just discernment, calm, and a rational approach, that's the first step towards treating this with the kind of balanced understanding that we need.
Thank you very much to all of you. I would love to talk a few more hours with you, but we have to cut off now. Thanks a lot for your time. See you soon and have a great rest of the day. Thanks.